Let me tell you about Vivian Cross, 46 years old. Chair of the board at Halcyon Robotics, a publicly traded industrial automation company she had co-founded 19 years earlier and built into a $4.1 billion enterprise serving manufacturing clients across 11 countries. Vivian was not a ceremonial chair, she read every quarterly filing line by line. Asked the questions other directors were afraid to ask. Remembered exactly what every executive had promised in every meeting going back a decade. She had taken Halcyon public herself, had negotiated the terms of their first institutional partnerships, had rebuilt the company after a near-fatal liquidity crisis in year 7 that the rest of the board had wanted to handle with a press release and optimism. She believed, without apology, that accountability was not aggression, it was the job. The CEO was Gregory Halley, 54 years old, charming, smooth in meetings. The kind of executive who managed the board better than he managed the company. For 3 consecutive years, operating margins had compressed. A major product launch had failed publicly. A second initiative Gregory had personally championed in board meetings was quietly cancelled after 14 months of engineering resources and nothing delivered. Executive compensation, including Gregory's, had increased 22% over the same period. Vivian had raised every one of these issues, in writing, in board sessions. In conversations Gregory described to allies as unnecessarily confrontational. She had pushed for an independent compensation review. Gregory framed it as a lack of trust. She had asked for a strategic accountability framework with measurable milestones. Gregory described it privately as micromanagement from the boardroom. She had requested a formal review of the failed product launch. Gregory told 2 directors she was trying to undermine leadership momentum. Slowly, dinner by dinner, call by call, Gregory built a majority, not through results. Through access and relationship and the patient work of convincing 6 people that the problem in the room was not his performance but her tone. On a Thursday afternoon in March, at a board meeting Vivian had no reason to distrust, Gregory made his move. A motion to remove Vivian Cross as chair of the board, stated reason. Leadership style concerns inconsistent with collaborative governance. The vote was 6-3. Vivian remained on the board because only shareholders could remove a director. But she lost the chairmanship, the agenda control, and the authority that came with it. Gregory was appointed interim chair. He thanked her warmly. Said the company was grateful. Said this was about finding a more collaborative path forward. Vivian looked at him for a moment. She said very little, gathered her materials, shook the hands of the 3 directors who had voted with her, and walked out of the building into a late afternoon that was cold and very quiet. What Gregory did not understand was that Vivian controlled more than her own board seat. She held proxy voting authority over a block of shares that represented enough voting power to call a special shareholder meeting, nominate a new slate of directors, and remove any executive officer the board had appointed, including the entire C-suite Gregory had just spent 2 years protecting. This is the story of how one board chair was voted out for being too aggressive, and how 3 weeks later the people who removed her learned what aggressive actually looked like. Buckle up, because they took her chairmanship. They forgot to check who controlled the votes. The story started 19 years earlier when Vivian built Halcyon from nothing. She had understood from the beginning something most founders learn too late. Control of a company is not about title. It is about votes. As Halcyon grew and went public, Vivian maintained her own significant holdings and built genuine long-term relationships with 2 major institutional shareholders who had backed the company since its IPO. Over the years, both had granted her proxy voting authority over their shares for governance matters. She had never abused that trust. She used the authority sparingly and always in the interest of the shareholders she represented. The pension fund held 8% of Halcyon. The investment firm held 6%. Vivian personally held 9%. 23% total. Under the bylaws, 20% was enough to compel a special shareholder meeting. At that meeting, shareholders could vote on director elections and on resolutions concerning executive officer appointments. Gregory Halley had spent 2 years counting board votes. He had never once thought to count the shareholder votes behind them. Now, if you believe that real power is always quieter than the people who think they have it, subscribe to Tangled Stories. I am Brett. Around here, the ones who understand the votes always outlast the ones who count the chairs. Vivian went home on that Thursday, made herself dinner, sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, and thought carefully for a long time. Then she called Margaret Liu, corporate governance attorney. 20 years of experience in shareholder disputes and proxy contests. They removed me as chair, Vivian said. Style concerns. Did they remove you from the board? Margaret asked. They cannot, Vivian said. Only shareholders can do that. And your proxy authority, Margaret asked. Still intact, Vivian said. Both institutions, 23%. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Do you want to respond to this or do you want to end it? She asked. Vivian thought about 3 years of declining performance. A CEO who spent his energy managing the board instead of running the business. 6 directors who had decided that asking hard questions was the same thing as causing problems. I want what is best for the company, she said. And what is best for the company is not Gregory Halley. Then we call a special meeting, Margaret said. Do nothing public. No press. No posts. Give me a week. Vivian understood. She hung up. And went to work. She spent the following week doing 3 things. First, she contacted both institutional shareholders directly. She did not ask for anything. She informed them. She walked each one through what had happened at the board meeting and through Gregory's 3-year performance record. The margin compression. The failed launches, the compensation increases. The gap between what had been promised and what had been delivered. She presented the information factually and then she stopped talking. Both institutions reviewed the data independently over the following 2 days. Both reached the same conclusion. Both confirmed their proxy authority remained in place and authorized Vivian to act on their behalf. Second, she prepared the shareholder communication, not a campaign. Not a public statement designed to embarrass anyone. A factual document. Clean and specific and impossible to argue with on the numbers alone. The performance record, the compensation trajectory, the governance concern raised by removing the board's most accountable member, and the proposed new slate. She had identified a replacement CEO herself, a former Halcyon division president, well regarded internally and in the industry, who had left 2 years earlier because Gregory had systematically excluded him from strategic decisions. When Vivian called him, he listened without interrupting. Then he said, I have been waiting for this call. Third, she called the 2 directors who had voted with her, not to organize a campaign. Simply to tell them what was coming so they were not blindsided. Both said the same thing in different words. It is about time. Margaret filed the special meeting request on a Monday morning, precise, properly documented, and legally airtight. The company had no basis to refuse it. Gregory received notice on Tuesday. He called the corporate secretary immediately. Can she actually do this? He asked. The secretary, who had been at Halcyon for 13 years, answered carefully and completely. 9% personal, 14% proxy, 23 total. The bylaws require 20. Yes, she can. Gregory called an emergency session with his allied directors that afternoon. The mood was entirely different from 3 weeks earlier. They had voted with the confidence of people who believed they had resolved a problem. Now they were sitting with the specific discomfort of people who had discovered the problem, had simply been waiting. Can we challenge the filing? One director asked. Margaret had already answered that in the filing itself. No. Can we negotiate? Another asked. On what grounds? A third replied. Nobody had a good answer. The special meeting was scheduled for 3 weeks from the filing date. During those 3 weeks, Vivian gave no interviews, made no public statements, did not wage a visible proxy campaign that would signal instability to clients and partners. She distributed the factual shareholder communication through proper channels and let it stand on its own. Because she understood something Gregory had never fully grasped. When the performance record is that clear, you do not need rhetoric. You just need investors to read the numbers. They read them. Proxy advisory firms reviewed the same 3-year record, rising compensation, declining margins. A stock that had underperformed the sector by 31%. A board that had removed its most accountable member for asking too many questions. Their recommendation was unanimous. Vote with Vivian's slate. The vote was not close. Vivian's 23%, combined with the broader shareholder support her communication had earned, carried every measure by a significant margin. The new slate of directors was elected. The former division president was appointed CEO effective immediately. And then the shareholders passed the resolution nobody in Gregory's camp had fully prepared for. A direct vote on executive officers. The chief operating officer Gregory had hired, removed. The chief financial officer who had approved the rising compensation packages, removed. The chief strategy officer who had championed the failed initiatives alongside Gregory, removed. And Gregory Halley, removed. 3 weeks after they had voted out Vivian Cross for being too aggressive. Vivian was reinstated as chair of the board by unanimous vote of the newly constituted board at its first session. She opened the meeting by looking around the table once. The company before the personalities, she said, always. The first quarter under new leadership produced the first margin improvement in 4 years. the stock began recovering. Clients who had quietly stalled conversations started returning. Gregory left with a contractual separation he was owed and nothing more. His departure was described in a press release as a leadership transition. The financial press described it differently. 3 of the 6 directors who have voted against Vivian did not stand for re-election when their terms came up. The other 3 remained. 2 told Vivian directly that they had made the wrong call. She accepted both conversations the same way. Then let us make sure it does not happen again, she said. Vivian implemented the Cross rule in her first session back. Any motion to remove a board officer required written notice with stated reasons and supporting documentation distributed to all directors 10 business days before any vote. No more surprise motions, no more ambushes dressed as routine business. She also implemented a governance review cycle. Every 3 years, an independent external governance firm would assess board composition and accountability structures and report directly to shareholders, not to management. To shareholders, the 2 institutional investors renewed their proxy authority at year-end, unprompted, no note attached. None was needed. Vivian kept the original shareholder agreement from year 1 in the top drawer of her desk, not framed, not displayed. Just there. A reminder that she had understood from the very beginning what kind of power actually lasts. Not the kind that lives in a title. The kind that lives in trust built over 19 years and documented in a shareholder register that nobody thought to check. And that, my friends, is how one board chair voted out on a Thursday afternoon removed an entire C-suite 3 weeks later by understanding something the people who removed her never did, that the boardroom is where decisions are announced. The shareholder register is where they are made. Vivian had understood that since year 1. Gregory found out 3 weeks after the vote. If this story hit your justice receptors, subscribe to Tangled Stories, drop a like, and share this with anyone who has ever been called too aggressive for simply refusing to pretend that bad numbers are good ones. Because here, every story has a twist. And sometimes that twist controls 23% of the company. I am Brett, and I will see you in the next one.